steam is let out from the pigeon, it will slide across the wire, and it basically is propelled along that wire only. Hindi siya malupad. But it was a good demonstration of Newton's third law already. Considering Newton's laws of motion, of Newton's three laws of motion were published in the 17th century. So that was around late 1600s ito siya na publish. So layo kayo from 400 BC to the year 1600s. As early as then, it was already demonstrated. So there's this common misconception that our ancestors didn't really care much about space or the natural world. They were thinkers as well. They
Merry
were
Christmas.
curious. They just didn't have they didn't have the level of knowledge that we had now. But they were just as curious. And then 300 years later, in 100 BC, uh, some Greek named the hero of Alexandria created the first steam engine. It wasn't a useful engine. If you saw the module, kung ano siya, it was just a kettle. Mounted on the kettle was a rotating sphere connected using tubes. And as the steam escaped the sphere, mutuyok siya. It wasn't useful. There was no practical use for it, but it was again another good demonstration, and it exhibited the propulsion of rocketry. So at the time, wala pa sila magamitan na to, but it was already demonstrated that they knew how the principles work. Jump that and fast forward to 1232 AD. We had the Chinese fire rockets. They are considered the very first true rockets. True rockets in the sense that they are propelled, unlike the pigeon of Archytas. That pigeon was suspended with a wire. If wala tong wire, dili siya kalupad since it's not aerodynamic. But the Chinese fire rockets were the very first rockets, true rockets. And they were developed in a time of great threat under the Mongols. If you're familiar with the history of China, especially during the time of Genghis Khan. So moto siyang panahon na. They were under threat from Genghis Khan and the Mongols. That's the reason why the Great Wall of China was built to prevent the Mongol invasion. And one of the other byproducts of that threat, aside from the Great Wall, were the Chinese fire rockets. This was a simple, ano na siya, it was just an arrow. You're familiar with the bow and arrow. So a regular arrow, you have the shaft, you have the tip of the arrow, and then there is a bamboo pipe. Loaded on this pipe is a primitive form of gunpowder, a combination of saltpeter. Saltpeter is potassium nitrate. Ano itong itawag ng potassium nitrate karon? It's also another component of rocket propellants, but it's primarily used as fertilizer. So can be used as fertilizer, can be used as propellant as well, depending on the concentration. So saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal ang sulod sa yang pipe. Now initially, these rockets were drawn with a bow. So bow and arrow siya. You draw the bow through the or you fire the arrow by drawing the bow, and then the pipe containing the gunpowder will serve as a warhead. Eventually, the Chinese would learn that these rockets can be launched without the bow. So instead of drawing the bow, you're familiar with the bow, diba? Inato mo and then you release it, it will let the arrow loose, it will let the arrow fly. So instead of releasing it, they discovered that simply by igniting the gunpowder, the rocket can or the arrow can fly on its own. So that's why it's considered the first true rocket. Dili na siya kinahanglan og uh, external source of energy for it to fly. So the history of how they were created was a bit of a mystery. Apparently, it was discovered by accident when the Chinese are very fond of fireworks and they have several festivals. One of the fireworks that they used was a kanang bamboo pipe gihapon. but they, instead of launching the pipe, they would throw it into the fire. And some of these fireworks, they were expected to explode. Some of them didn't properly explode, and instead of exploding, they would fly off from the fire source. Ilang iit siya sa kayo, and instead of exploding on the fire, they would fly off. So they realized, okay, pwede din siya gamiton for propelling something. They didn't know what for until the Mongol threat arrived. So the Mongols were actually very impressed by this technology. It was so effective. It wasn't effective in the sense that it was deadly or lethal. The arrow itself was lethal, but the explosion, gagmay ram siyang explosion. Basically, fireworks ra gyapon siya. So what it did was, as fireworks, it produced loud sounds, it produced bright lights, and these sounds and bright lights would actually cause panic, especially on the Mongol horses. If you're familiar with the Mongols, they were nomadic people. They traveled around and they had horses. Every Mongolian person in the time of Genghis Khan was expected to own a horse. So they were expert horse riders, and horses, they tend to get scared easily. So mabungkag ilang formation, and it would cause casualties on the Mongols simply because of the panic that the fireworks caused to their horses. They were so impressed with these rockets that actually the Mongols developed it themselves. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, would use it against the Chinese eventually. So gibalik sa ilang technology, and it became much louder, much brighter, still not deadly, but it was effective to cause confusion, to cause panic on the ranks of the Chinese. So rockets were already used for warfare before, but not really as a means to to injure or to kill. It wasn't a weapon in that sense. It was more a psychological weapon. So within between the 13th to 15th centuries, the Mongols were credited with spreading gunpowder and rocketry in general to Europe. They were so impressed by this technology, they developed it themselves. They would eventually trade the technology with the Europeans. So they went far from China in Asia to Europe. In they would go as far inland, I believe, as Germany. Tuloy sila naabtan. They crossed the deserts of Saudi. So all through the 13th to 15th centuries, there were several experiments to improve the rockets. So the Mongols brought it to Europe, the Europeans improved it themselves. So three people were of important focus. Roger Bacon, a monk from England, he worked on improved forms of gunpowder. So this improved the range of their rockets. Instead of the usual saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, they removed some of the charcoal, replaced it with more, I think, saltpeter, ilang gitimpla to, and some other chemicals. They would improve the explosion of the gunpowder, and they would make the rockets more efficient. Jean Froissart, a French-born medieval author, also found that rocket trajectories were more accurate when launched from tubes. Now, originally, the Chinese fire rockets were originally from bows. They transitioned to a simple, paano na to siya? It was just a tube, an open tube, mura siya half, uh, imagine a pipe, bamboo na itong gamiton. If you have a bamboo pole, and then you cut that pole in half, you would have something that effectively looked like this. Okay. And the rocket was mounted just on top of this half pipe. So ipatong sa dara. The problem is, since this is not enclosed, the exhaust gases are not focused in one direction. So although the rocket will launch, it is not very accurate. So the invention by John Frusciante, his discovery that launching a rocket inside a pipe was very significant. It improved the range of rockets, not to the point nga it had pinpoint accuracy. Wala pa may guidance ang rockets, so they didn't have the type of control that we have today, but they were significantly much more accurate. Then there was Jones di Fontana, a man from Italy, who designed a surface-running rocket-powered torpedo. So this was used for. This was not like the other rockets where it actually flew. It was a torpedo, more like a boat that would float on water. They ignited the gunpowder inside the torpedo, and it would float across the water. And maigo niyang barko so na ships before were made of wood. When they hit a ship, they would ignite the ship, kahoy naman do, and they would burn and sink. So this was the earliest form. This was the first torpedo used in history. Still made use of rocket propulsion, but they didn't fly. Now, in 1591, this is a significant discovery. The first multi-stage rocket. If you're familiar with our rockets nowadays, they are all multi-stage. The idea of multi-staging, the purpose of multi-staging is, if you had a rocket, you have a you have a tube. You have the payload here at the top, the nose cone, and you have your combustion chamber or the rocket chamber, your fins. So this is loaded with propellant. Puno na siya initially. As the rocket went higher, makuhaan na siya propellant. So say for example at a certain point, katunga na rin mabilin sa propellant, half of it. So half of it is filled with propellant, the other half is not. The problem is, kani siya nga portion, this lower half of the rocket is dead weight. There's no propellant left in this portion. Ano magdala-dala pa man kana. So you would remove that lower half, you will be left with the upper half of your rocket. So you now have a rocket that has two stages. What this does is, since you have removed the dead weight kay sa ubos, mugamay ang weight sa rocket, mo improve yung acceleration given nga gamay nila yung propellant. This would improve the range of rockets. They would allow them to fly higher and fly further. So the very first demonstration of multi-staging was by Johann Schmidlap, a German fireworks maker. So ang tawag sa rocket at the time was the step rocket because there were two steps. And if we look at the module, na dito ang iyahang schematic. So it was achieved by enclosing multiple stages. So instead of mo separate ra ang iyahang stage, you had a primary tube. Inside the primary tube, you had smaller tubes. This wasn't limited to two stages. Niabot niya siya actually of three stages later on. But initially, this started with two stages. So you have the primary tube. Inside the primary tube, you had the smaller chambers, the individual rockets. So, ang kaning outer tube was just made out of flammable material. I believe some, para sa carton siguro, cardboard, paper. Most rocket tubes were made of paper mache. So, mahurot ang propellant diri at the same time nga mahurot ang propellant sa first tank. The tube would burn up to this point. Masunog ng tube. Solid propellant man yung da. Masunog ang tube, wala na mo put sa first tank. The first tank will now drop. The second tank will remain connected to the payload diri which carried the firework motong mobuto as it reached its destination. So the timing here has only to do with the amount of propellant within this chamber and this paper. It's very ingenious kay wala siya sensor of course. Karaan mo siyang rocket. So iyang gitime such that by the time mahurot ang propellant on the first chamber, masunog pud imo ang tube diri And when it has burned out, what mo kupot ani, it will separate from the rocket. So that's how it works. the step rocket. Okay, there is a Chinese legend. Now, initially, what we've covered so far are applications of rockets that do not involve any form of transportation. We use rockets now to transport humans and payload into space, but back then it was primarily used for fireworks and as weaponry. Now, there was an attempt there, but this is a Chinese legend. There's no proof that it existed. It's an amusing story. An officer by the name of Wan Hu, who tried to launch himself by igniting 47 fire rockets under his chair. Obviously, that didn't work, and there was no trace of him left at the time. If this was true, then this would be the very first attempt for rocket propulsion with a human payload. Now, of course, that ended in catastrophe. So in 17th to 18th century, now this was a time of great improvement for rockets. There were several wars fought across the world. If you notice the pattern, warfare is one of the leading uh, leading pioneers in advancing technology. This is not limited to rockets. If you're familiar with the other technologies, sonar technology was developed greatly in World War II. Radar was also developed in World War II. We use them now for non-aggressive purposes, but back in the day, they had a very specific purpose, military application. Same with rockets. So in the 17th to 18th century, now there were several wars fought across the world, and also along this time, this was the Renaissance. This was the time when Newton, in year 1687, Isaac Newton would publish his works on Newton's three laws. So among the many improvements, one was provided by William Gravesend. So he built model cars propelled by jets of steam. So dili pa ni siya rocket application, but they tested first rocket propulsion on land using cars. And then this was followed by the rocket experiments in Germany and Russia. These were some unknown scientists, but they experimented with large rockets, larger than what were already available at the time. Gagmay man na rockets una. The rockets were not large, the payloads were not huge. They were deadly not because they were accurate and because of their explosive power. They were deadly because they were employed in mass. Rocket barrage to siya. Small rockets that were launched in huge numbers to a certain area. Murag artillery. Now, kaning experiment performed by Germany and Russia was the first attempt at a very large rocket, one rocket with a very strong payload instead of multiple small rockets. It was so powerful that they would leave holes on the ground where they were launched, but it wasn't significantly used. And then came the Mysorean rockets. So the Mysores, they are people from India. So there were a tribe of people who were at war with the British Empire. The British occupied India at some point. So British occupied India had a lot of wars, and one of these was against the Mysoreans. They had a rocket that they used
Siya lang
against the
hatod
British
siyang
that would later be dubbed
kwarta ni
the
Joy.
Mysorean rocket. It was the first iron case rocket. So the advantage of having an iron case is that it would allow for greater pressures to build up in within the rocket. Diba, initially the rockets were made out of paper or some form of weak material. The problem with that is gamay lang pressure buildup. Remember that our rockets, how we define rockets is that they are an enclosed chamber that would allow a pressurized gas to escape. And the higher the pressure of that gas, the better the propulsion, the better the range of your rocket. With paper rockets, gamay rang ilahang ma-store nga pressure, they would still burn but not with as much pressure as an iron case rocket. Iron casings do not break as easily. So the advantage, motong advantage sa Mysorean rockets, they had higher They had better range compared to the rockets available to the British. The British also had rockets, but they didn't really use them for warfare. So they were caught off guard. They were ambushed and they suffered several losses. They were impressed by this, and eventually they would study these Mysorean rockets and they would derive the Congreve rockets. The Congreve rockets were created by William Congreve, a British officer. So he would improve. Initially, the British rockets were capable of traveling 600 yards. It would eventually improve to 1,500, then 2,000 yards, until na-reach niya ang 3,000 yards. 3,000 yards in metric is about 2,700 meters. That's 2.7 kilometers. That's the equivalent of modern artillery. So, dako-dako siya improvement. The difference is with modern artillery, mas dako ang payload. Gamay na yung payload, kay most of this was propellant, so gamay ang explosion, but it was still it had significantly higher range. And then came William Hale. William Yapon, his family name is William Hale. So William Hale, although Congreve improved the range of rockets, he didn't really improve the accuracy. And again, the devastating effect of rockets did not come from their size, it came from their numbers. So William Hale would improve on that by making use of what is called spin stabilization. Similar to a bullet fired from a rifle, patuyuko na siya, it would stabilize the bullet during flight. Your rocket did the same. Morning gibuhat ni William Hale with his rockets. So this would eventually be used for modern rocketry. Now I'd like to introduce the three founding fathers. We have Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. He was a Russian school teacher. These are the founding fathers of rocketry. Now, three of them are known. The fourth is not really known. So Konstantin Tsiolkovsky would be credited with discovering the rocket equation. He said that the range of a rocket was limited only by the exhaust velocity of escaping gases. This was the central idea. Because in modern rocketry, since wala kayo siya gigamit for weapons, the goal was for space travel. So this statement was central to the rocket equation that would be used eventually. Then came Robert Goddard. He was an American. Goddard would experiment with solid propellants initially, and he later found that liquid propellants, he had this hypothesis that liquid propellants were better at sending rockets at longer distances. The problem was, at the time, with their technology, lisod siya buhaton. There are certain disadvantages to liquid-propelled rockets, as we will discuss later on. One of them, I'll give you some insights lang. One of them is the added weight. Obviously, unlike a solid propellant, you have a tube. Pansak mo ang propellant dira sa sud sa tube. Doesn't matter how you put it inside the tube. So the problem with solid propellants, they didn't produce as much thrust compared to liquid propellants. So liquid propellants, they needed, although they produced a lot of thrust, they needed extra storage. Unlike solid propellants, di mo pwede ipansak ng liquid inside this tube. Because once they burned out, for example, makuhaan siya sulod, eventually, mugamay yung content. So say for example, the level of propellant is down to here. If the rocket were to move, if it were to change orientation, for example, and it did move around a lot, especially if it was spin stabilized, magtuyok na siya. Imagine that the liquid will no longer remain level, di ba? It will move around as well. And the problem is, this would affect the propulsion of the rocket. This will move the center of mass around. Yung center of gravity maglihok-lihok. It was not stable. So you wanted to keep that fuel from moving around. You needed tanks. So separate storage na. You have a tank. For example, you have an upper chamber here. You have a tank for the fuel. You have a tank for the propellant, and you connect them down to the combustion chamber. Diri siya mo burn imuhang fuel and oxidizer mixture. So that's the problem with liquid propellants. Goddard would eventually improve on liquid propelled rockets. His initial launches were not very impressive. The first launch that he made landed in a cabbage patch 56 meters away. And at the time, gikatawan siya sa media. He was ridiculed. So he was so pissed off that he would not share his work with anyone. Wala siya nakig-cooperate with other people until he met Werner von Braun later on. Then there was Hermann Oberth, a German rocket scientist. His primary contribution was the publication of a book. This book would encourage certain groups across Europe, rocket enthusiasts, to pop up. And because of these rocket enthusiasts, the development of rocket propulsion improved greatly. So they would conduct their own experiments, individual experiments, not necessarily funded by the government. So these were private ventures, and they improved rocket propulsion a lot. And Hermann Oberth also mentored Werner von Braun, who would eventually meet with Robert Goddard. Now, considered the fourth founding father, is Robert Peltieri. Now, this man, along with Tsiolkovsky, he did not know of Tsiolkovsky's work. He worked independently as well in France. Separate niya siya trabaho. Now, he also derived the rocket equation. So Tsiolkovsky himself derived the rocket equation, and then at some point, Robert Peltieri also derived the rocket equation. So this would back up the work of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Someone else who did not work with him was able to arrive to the same equation. So the chances of that happening at that time very slim. So this would be a significant discovery at the time. Although wala kay siya aside from his contribution with the rocket equation, wala kay siya nahatag to rocket propulsion. He would be credited the fourth founding father, since it was thanks to him na na-verify ang trabaho ni Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Now, World War II. World War II was one of the, if you're familiar with World War II, it was one of the darkest parts of history, with what the Nazis had managed to do at the time. But along with such atrocities, that they would create one of the most powerful weapons of war, the Vengeance rocket. This was commissioned by Hitler. He wanted a rocket that could travel from Germany to London, the capital of England, because England was a staging ground for the Allied forces. As much as America was a threat to Germany, sila man itong primary threat sa Germans. Americans couldn't easily invade Germany without the help of, or without London as a staging ground. They set up a base in the UK, and Germany wanted to target that capital city, London. So Hitler asked for a rocket to be created that can launch from Germany to London. This was a significant step up at the time. This was the first ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. Most missiles were launched from a cannon or some sort of barrel a short distance away. The V2 was launched from a separate city and sent to another city, to another country, across the British Channel. So this was a big step up, and the head of this operation, the design and manufacture of this rocket, was Werner von Braun. He he had some support from obviously he had some support from the Nazis, but he managed to accomplish this feat. Thankfully, sorte lang ang mga taga London. Of course, the British were terrified with this prospect. They were lucky because the Vengeance rocket arrived too late into the war to make any significant uh, improvements to the situations of the German. So Werner von Braun employed Robert Goddard's work. He would use liquid propulsion for the V2 rocket. He did not know of his work. They worked independently from each other. But they also realized that rocket propellants were better than solid propellants. Now, eventually, as you know, Germany lost the war. So the Russians came in from the east. The Americans came in from the west. So they captured most of the German scientists and its V2 project. So they independently took the V2 project home. So the US secretly took home some of the V2 project. The Russians also secretly took home some of the V2 project. And the US managed to nab Werner von Braun. Von Braun surrendered to the US, not surrendered to the Russians, to the Soviets. So dito siya sa US, and he would later on spearhead the space program of the US using the same technology that he used for the V2 rockets. So now let's go back to Russia one bit. After they won the war, they developed their rocket program, their space program. Now, the US primarily they wanted to develop their rockets for non-military applications. They wanted to use them as sounding rockets. Sounding rockets, these are instrument carrying rockets that would be sent into the atmosphere. Magdala siya sensory equipment, and they could detect the level of humidity, the amount of or they could check the volume of water vapor within within that portion of the sky. They could also check for movement in the ground. They could take images, but these sounding rockets would eventually fall back to Earth. Wala, di man siya orbit. They would launch high into the atmosphere, take some recordings, take some pictures, and then drop back down. So for surveillance na siya. The Russians developed it a different way. Sergei Korolev would would eventually launch a rocket into space. He was not an astronaut, but he was a rocket designer. He would launch a rocket into space carrying the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1. And the Americans, the world was stunned by this achievement. Although Sputnik lasted in orbit only for a few hours, this would prove that space travel was possible. And the Cold War started. This space race officially started. Nagdumot na ang US because they were one up by the Russians. So eventually they would step up their space program, and within the next 10 years the goal has changed. So instead of just arriving into space, the Americans made a higher wager. They said, let's 10 years within 10 years we will arrive to the moon, first to the moon, and they did achieve that. So the Russians initially had some achievements first from the US. They were the first to send an artificial satellite into space. They were also the first to send a man into space. He didn't land on the moon, but he did arrive into space. That was Yuri Gagarin. He orbited space for a few days, returned back into Earth. So first man and first artificial satellite into space was credited to the Russians. And because of this, the pressure was on for the US. They would eventually send the three astronauts into the moon. And yes, there were actually three astronauts in case you didn't know. There was one other astronaut who orbited the moon. He didn't land. He just stayed in orbit lang. So the Cold War would have a lasting impression on rocket propulsion. Because of this, the Apollo mission was launched by the US into the moon, sending Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to land on the moon, along with a third person that was Phil Collins, the man responsible for sending all three of them home. So they stepped up their rockets to be able to actually arrive to the moon. So it had a very significant impression. Ang achievement sa Russians, this competitive nature would allow the Americans to develop their space program. And eventually, when the Cold War ended, there was a collaboration. Instead of competition, they opted for collaboration, and they created the International Space Station. It initially started with just two modules from the Americans and the Russians, and now it has expanded to have the Japanese, the Chinese, and other nationalities in there. I think India also has a module. I believe the Philippines, we don't have our own module that we sent there, but I think we are allocated a module in the ISS as well. So that was the evolution basically of rocket propulsion across history. So, you have any questions so far? It's a very straightforward topic. Wala makita yung concepts, gi-explore diri yan. You have any questions, clarifications? Okay, so if there are no questions, take note lang of you will have your quiz this coming Thursday. So that will be, just be familiar, multiple choice mo ni siya. Just be familiar with the contributions of the people that I've mentioned in the module. Who these people were, what they contributed, and yeah, who these people were and what they contributed. For example, William Congreve, he would improve the accuracy of the rockets and he created the Congreve rockets. So kana siya familiarize these contributions. I don't think there will be any dates nga manggawas nito sa inyong quiz. So mostly just the people and their contributions. The three founding fathers, what they contributed, familiarize that as well. So kadto sila tanan, the people and their contributions. That's basically what I wanted to tackle with you. So if there are no questions or clarifications, I'll see you next Tuesday. Good luck on your quiz this Thursday and enjoy your intramurals week. So you have a good day. Wala na essay. Yes, wala na essay. All right. You have a good day. I'll close the room now.